You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Are you a 3CR subscriber?
We really need our listeners to subscribe to the station. It helps us remain financially independent and is an important part of our community governance.
It's just $40 concession, $80 waged, $150 for a band or organisation, and $300 solidarity.
Become a 3CR subscriber today.
3CR Radical Radio.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Guess what? 3rd of December, Tuesday, next week, is the 170th anniversary of the Eureka Rebellion. So what has it got to do with us in 2024? If there's one event in Australian history which has been misconstrued, misanalysed, in which plays, films, documentaries, books have been written about, the Eureka Rebellion is par excellence an example of a radical part of our history which has been transformed into some sugarine, acceptable, thing. Unlike the rest of Australia, the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion celebrations group, in conjunction with Ballarat and Western Regions Trades Hall, will be once again hosting our 18-hour Eureka Celebration Spectacular. It'll start at 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. with a dawn ceremony at the Eureka Stockade Gardens at the corner of Eureka and Stall Street in Ballarat. Now, if you can't make it, if you're listening interstate, don't despair. The first 2 hours will be broadcast live on Community Radio 3CR. You can access that by going to 3cr.org.au if you aren't in a reception area. Communal breakfast from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Eureka Australia medal presentations at Bakery Hill. Bakery Hill was the site at which the Eureka flag was risen for the first time on the 29th of November 1854. And this year we have 7 Eureka Australia Day medal recipients. I'll read out their names. Some you know, some you won't know. Hopefully most of them will be able to come to Ballarat. A few may not. There's Belinda Coates, Dr. Lana Cormie, John Glazebrook, Barry Horsburgh, Nassa Mashin, Annie McLaughlin, and Senator Lydia Thorpe. They've all agreed to accept a Eureka Australia Day medal. And the main reason we pick people that may be known to you and people you've never heard of is these are people who through their lives have done what they can to improve the lives of the people in the communities they live in and work in. And the Eureka Oath highlights the essential elements of the Eureka Rebellion. And that's why the Eureka Oath is such an important symbol. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. Now, the Eureka Oath encapsulates the 4 pillars of the Eureka Rebellion, which are as relevant today as they were almost 170 years ago. Now, you've got all types of people hanging on to the Eureka legend. You've got people describing Eureka as a revolt by small business people. That's our liberal, national, libertarian, mates. Then you've got our white supremacists who've got no understanding of history, or no interest, claiming it was a white supremacist revolt. And the list goes on and on and on. Everybody hangs on to the Eureka Rebellion. You can even get Eureka tiles if you want to. You name it, you get it. But the reality is, as I said before, it's encapsulated in the Eureka Oath. We, remember, this is the 29th of November 1854, we, that's us, everybody, irrespective of religion, colour, what binds us is our common oppressor. And our common oppressor in 2024 is a system which continues to reward the powerful, a system which continues to oppress millions of people in this country, a country which in reality, a sovereign nation state in reality, which should be paradise on earth, considering how many few people there are on this continent and the extraordinary resources we have on this continent. So we, everybody, we swear by the Southern Cross. Now, a lot of people think the Southern Cross is some type of religious symbol. It's not. Ballarat in 1853, 1854 was a tent city. And when you live in a tent city, and if any of you have gone camping with a lot of other people, when you stumble out of your tent in the morning, you really don't know where you are. So the baker had a flag. The lemonade salesman had a flag. The local theatre had a flag. The local newspaper had a flag. So when you got out of your tent, you could see that symbol and you could walk towards that symbol and fulfil your needs. Now, when the Ballarat Reform League was formed on the 11th of November 1854, that pivotal date, which we speak about over and over again, the 11th of November 1854, they had no symbols. And the story goes that one of the gentlemen involved in the discussions regarding the Ballarat Reform League went out to relieve himself under the stars. And as he looked up, he saw the Southern Cross. Now, the brilliant thing about the Southern Cross, it's a symbol that can only be seen in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's not forget that most of the people who came here came from the Northern Hemisphere. They'd never seen the Southern Cross, and when they were lying in their tents or on the ground at night, the Southern Cross demonstrated to them that they had come to a new world. And in that new world, they wanted to create something that left behind the oppression and inequalities of the world they had left. I mean, these weren't simple people looking for gold. Many of these were survivors of many of the revolutionary movements which occurred in Europe in 1854, the survivors of the Chartist movement from England, who had a big influence on the Eureka Rebellion, and the list goes on and on. So these were hardened, in many regards, political activists. And if you find yourself in the old Ballarat cemetery and you go to the mass grave, as you walk towards the mass grave, there's a little alcove of some newspaper in it. And on the day after, the newspapers, the government newspapers in Victoria, were talking about anarchists and ruffians being involved in the Eureka Rebellion. So let's not forget that. There's a huge political aspect. We swear by the Southern Cross. Interestingly, we'll have representatives from the West Papuan independence movement will be coming to the dawn ceremony. And that evening, members of the West Papuan Community Choir will be entertaining people at the dinner. Okay? So why? And the other interesting fact is when you look up in the sky, and if you're there at 4 a.m. and it's not cloudy, you'll be able to see this. You can see the morning star, which is the symbol of the West Papuan independence movement. And these, the Southern Cross and the morning star, are the only two celestial symbols or that we can see in the Southern Hemisphere that people in the Northern Hemisphere can't see. So we swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. I mean, solidarity, the whole trade union movement was based on the concept of solidarity. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. These people believe they were born with inalienable rights and liberties that no government, no business could take away from them. So what are the four pillars? The first pillar is internationalism. We had people from around the globe. Of the 112 people that were arrested after the Eureka Rebellion, and the 13 went to trial, we had John Joseph, an Afro-American a freed slave from New York, the first man to be tried for high treason for his involvement in the Eureka Rebellion. He was responsible for fatally wounding Captain Wise, who was the deputy commander of the invading British forces. And when he went to trial in Melbourne in February 1855, he was acquitted by his peers and was chaired through the streets of Melbourne by thousands of people who had gathered at the courthouse to ensure that justice was done. And of the 13, you've got people with Jewish names, another black man from Kingston, Jamaica. You had people from every corner of the universe, including one gentleman who was born in Sydney town, believe it or not. So internationalism is one pillar. The next pillar is solidarity. Eureka was about people coming together to not only fight against a gold licence, but fight for the right of representation and fight for a right to access land. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight. It's about direct action. These people took up arms to defend their rights and liberties, and they paid the price. Because although over 20,000 people attended the mass meeting on the 29th of November 1854, and about 2,000 were drilling, elected their leaders and were drilling in military formation in the stockade on the Saturday on the 2nd, when the troops and the Victoria Police attacked on the 3rd of December, there was only 104 miners left in the stockade. It's about internationalism, direct action, solidarity, and the last and final principle is about direct democracy, not representative democracy, although the Eureka, the Ballarat Reform League, the organisation behind the Eureka Rebellion, wanted parliamentary reform. The fact is, they organised on direct democratic principles. They held mass meetings. They made decisions. They appointed or elected delegates to go to Melbourne to negotiate with the government of the day, led by Hotham. They came back to a mass meeting, reported back to the people at that meeting. So this was direct democracy in action. So the four pillars the four pillars of Eureka are internationalism, direct action, direct democracy, solidarity, and you can see these principles enshrined in the Eureka Oath. Now, the fact is that of the 13 people who were arrested, all were acquitted by juries in Melbourne. And by the end of 1855, the colonial authorities, concerned about a mass revolt in Victoria, which had been proclaimed an independent colony in 1851, acquiesced. And many of the people who were at the forefront of that rebellion found themselves in Parliament or found themselves appointed to judicial positions because the government understood that it needed to accept the demands of the Ballarat Reform League, and almost every one of those demands was met except for yearly parliaments. So it's an extraordinary period because of what happened, but it's more extraordinary because it highlights that this struggle has not changed. And those of you who think that Ballarat was just about, the miners, it was about small shopkeepers. It was about the local Indigenous population. And around 5 a.m, when the sun was rising, people were riddled with musket balls, dead on the battlefield. Over 50 died during that morning. Women jumped the stockade fence and draped themselves across the bodies of injured miners to protect them from being bayoneted to death. Now the soldiers, 240 redcoats, soldiers from the 12th and 12th and 40th Regiment, were relatively disciplined. But the 90 mounted Victoria Police, who had been responsible for implementing the collection of the gold licence, went on an orgy of killing, arson and theft. And for the next 4 hours, they roamed across the goldfields, up to 5 kilometres from the Eureka Centre, doing killing, burning, stealing. And the Victoria Police was formed in 1853, and they've never apologised for the actions of that police force, which was involved in one of the major massacres. Now, those of you who think that this has got nothing to do with the First Nations people, Raphael Caboni was a shepherd. He was the leader of the non-English speaking miners at Eureka. And he lived with the local people in 1853. And he wrote over and over again that Aboriginal people that he lived with were the victims of British colonialism. Over and over again. It's all about, today we talk about decolonisation, but let's not forget there were people who saw First Nations people as the victims of British colonialism. And at the end of the day, the local people, local Indigenous people, collected the children that had been lost in the melee. Could you imagine it? Smoke, people screaming, tents burning, flesh burning, children scattering everywhere, and held them for the next 48 hours until their parents were able to collect them. This is a great, great moment in Australian history, a moment that's been written out to a significant degree of the Australian history books. And more importantly, the radical elements of this rebellion have been forgotten. And since 2002, the Anarchist Institute, when we created the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion Celebrations Group, have been holding these celebrations. And I encourage you to come. And if you can't come this year, come next year. And if you can't come next year, come the year after. Dawn ceremony, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. at the Eureka Stockade Gardens at the corner of Eureka and Stall Street in Ballarat. Communal breakfast at the Eureka Stockade site between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. Please bring food and drinks to share. Eureka Australia Medal presentations at Bakery Hill at the intersection of Victoria and Humphrey Street in Ballarat. 11:30 to 12:30, Eureka Mass Grave Ceremony at the Old Ballarat Cemetery. Please bring flowers to place on the grave. 1 p.m. to 2 p.m, lunch at Ballarat Trades Hall at 24 Camp Street. 3 p.m. to 4 p.m, History of the Eureka Flag. I'll be doing History of the Eureka Flag at the Eureka Centre, the home of the Eureka Flag. And 6 p.m. to 10 p.m, Eureka 170 dinner at the Queen's Head Hotel at 146 Humphrey Street, Ballarat East. Entertainment is provided by the West Parkland Community Choir. As I said at the beginning, just turn up to any of these events. You don't have to ring anybody, but the only event you really need to book for is the Eureka dinner. There's only about 80 can sit down at tables and about 30 maybe at the bar. So it's a small group of around 100 people. So if you want to come to the Eureka dinner, leave a message on 0439 395 489 or email me at anarchistage@yahoo.com. So hopefully we will see you on the 3rd of December. And if we don't despair. The dawn ceremony, to which people from across Australia will be coming, will be broadcast live on Community Radio 3CR. This is the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Let's move on to everyday reality, not just periods of celebration. Isn't it interesting how the Greens, the Australian Greens, have finally found out that they've been wedged by the Australian Labor Party, painted as an obstructionist force. They have finally seen sense. There's an election within the next 6 months. Has to be held before May 2025. And the coalition gearing up to take over has had an interesting partner, which is the Australian Greens, who have been trying to wrest a few more reforms from the Labor Party. But finally the Australian Greens have realised that to be wedged by the Australian Labor Party is a pathway to extinction. You lose nothing by passing some legislation which may not fulfil all your ambitions, but at least that legislation may have some positive impact. It reminds me of 10 years ago, was it 15 years ago now, when the Greens blocked climate reform, and the fact for the next 10 years we had these ongoing debates about nothing in particular, which were used to ensure that there was no action on climate reform. So I congratulate the Australian Greens for realising they've been wedged by the Labor Party, who believes that they can actually win a number of seats which are held by the Greens, especially in Queensland, and hopefully, they think they can govern in their own right. So congratulations, you've seen the writing on the wall. Move forward. There's an election. Put forward your policies, as you said you will, and people can then make a choice. Don't be wedged in, to protect the Liberal National Party coalition, the little Trumpies, the little chronic confabulators. Come on, give me a break. Now, have you noticed there's a little bit of kind of problems in the university sector? And they started a long time ago when the university sector was privatised. It was privatised in two ways: by the government of the day seeing universities as an unnecessary burden. And what they did is they introduced fees during the Hawke-Keating period, although the Whitlam Labor government was elected on a no-fee platform. And more importantly, they encouraged and forced the university sector to look overseas in order to bring in students to help pay for the sector. Now, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a new direction, initially pursued by the Morrison government and now pursued by the Labor Party. And that direction is to target, destroy, remove the majority of the humanities from universities. Universities are all about qualifications. They're no longer about education. So what's happening as privatised universities are finding they can't rake in the cash because the Liberal National Coalition, the opposition and the Australian Labor Party have now decided that immigration will be the issue of the day, and the best way to tackle that is to cut the intake of overseas students. What we are seeing is pressure on universities. And as the humanities fees were increased dramatically during the Morrison period, and now we're seeing university departments, especially history departments, being closed down or reduced. Now, a country that doesn't know its history is a country of no future. When I spoke about the Eureka Rebellion, I was trying to connect what happened 170 years ago to what's happening today. You need to understand. You need to know your past to understand the present and change the future. And what we've seen in this country is that we tend to have amnesia. History begins when we woke up. That's right. History begins when we woke up. And with the proliferation of social media, what we are seeing is facts have become disposable commodities. And that's why the great confabulator is so welcome in the US of A. So destroying history departments is retrograde as far as education is concerned. It's all very well producing automatons who can do things, but it's another thing producing generations which have an understanding of their background, who then can be involved in campaigns to make amends for the past by changing the present. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Well, sometimes you listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It is brought to you across Australia by the Community Radio Network, and the program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Now, I can be a little bit of an idiot sometimes. I'm happy to be called an idiot. And I can smell a political campaign coming up. Interesting, isn't it, that Australians in 2024 have to rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table to survive. You would think that in 2024 we would have woken up. We would have stopped fighting amongst ourselves. We would start moving forwards. We'd cut through the propaganda that if somebody speaks a different language, has a different sexual orientation, has a gender identity, different gender identity, has a different cultural background, a different religion, that somehow, as the Eureka rebels found, they had a common oppressor. And the way to move forward is to break down that common oppressor. And that common oppressor we have in 2024 is a corporate sector which is no longer regulated by government, which in many regards determines what legislation is presented to Parliament. And that's why we never seem to have any traction in terms of major changes in the way we live, taxation, and the list goes on and on. All right, so I'm going to put down some policies so we don't have to rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table. Now, these are particularly innocuous policies. I'm not talking about taking up arms like the Eureka rebels did in 1854. I mean, the state has all the armaments it needs to put down any rebellion. And that was the history of 1854. It was the reaction in the community after which created the momentum for change. Policy number 1, a universal basic income. The antidote to the jobs lost through the implementation of artificial intelligence. Think about it. This is one period in human history where we need a universal basic income for everybody. How do you finance it? A 1% financial transaction tax for transactions over $5,000. Now, the goods and services tax is about goods and services, and it hits the people who earn the least, the most. There's no financial transaction tax in this country. We need a 1% financial transaction tax. In an era where the great majority of transactions are conducted online, it is very simple to collect a 1% financial transaction tax. How about a 1% stock market turnover tax every time a share is bought or sold? Now, I can hear people throwing up their arms and saying, we are investors, we have superannuation. Well, look at your super. What a con. The more you earn, the more you put away, the better your retirement. The less you earn, the less you put away, the more difficult your retirement. It should be the other way around. So 1% stock market turnover tax every time a share is bought or sold. Now, these two measures would raise anywhere between $150 to $200 billion a year. That's right. And in a budget of around $1 trillion, this is, a 20% increase. 20% increase. And money raised could be used to finance the universal basic income and bolster revenue for public health, public education, the NDIS, public housing and public infrastructure. Another point. Why should we continue to hang onto the coattails of the US of a dying empire? Isn't it about time that we looked around and saw where Australia is situated? We're not situated on the west coast of America. We're not situated in the Northern Hemisphere. You can't attach some tugboats to Australis and pull it across to the west coast of Australia. We need to drastically reduce defence ties with the failing empire of the USA and strengthen defence ties with Australia's Asian neighbours. I mean, do you really want your grandchildren to be sacrificed? To support USA's foreign policy agenda? When we see what's happening in the US of A, when its allies are the ones that bear the price? Wasn't it about time we rebooted the failing reconciliation process by beginning negotiations with this country's First Nations people, not at a state-by-state level, but on a federal level? Now, a little bit controversial, but that's what the anarchist world this week is about, a little bit of controversy. Why shouldn't we nationalise without compensation all mineral resource corporations, both foreign-owned and locally owned, with an annual turnover over $100 million? Why shouldn't the benefits of this country's wealth be shared by all Australian, not just shareholders? It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's a little bit like you've got some fruit trees in the backyard and the front yard, and people come in and take all the fruit and leave you none, or leave you a few, that aren't fully ripe. That's what we've done with our mineral resources. As I said at the beginning of the program, this place should be heaven on earth. We should not have over 1.5 million children living in poverty. We should not have 1/3 of the population relying on social security benefits to survive. We should not have 50 to 60% of, the population wage slaves having to sacrifice their lives to keep a roof over their heads and pay rent or mortgage. None of this should be occurring in this country. We're supposedly a democratic country, a representative democracy. But why is it that the aspirations of people never seem to hit Parliament? And last but not least, why not use 1% of Australia's superannuation contributions to provide seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives? This would create a much-needed third tier in the Australian economy, increasing competition between a rapidly shrinking public sector, the all-powerful private sector, and an emerging cooperative and collective sector. Simple ideas, but considered to be radical in Australia in 2024. Whatever you say about the great confabulator, the fact is that he and his party was able to convince the American people that the billionaire classes would resolve all their problems. What a joke. So never again will Australians have to rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table, only if we decide to take action. Let's move on. Have you noticed, as far as green energy is concerned, that it's all about huge, centralised, corporate-owned facilities? That's what it's about. It's about them producing green energy, moving from coal and gas to green energy, much needed transition. But why should it only be, conducted by corporations who've got the money to set up centralised systems, centralised energy systems, which they own and control? The thing about solar and wind energy, which is the backbone of the transition, is that it is a system which can provide energy through a decentralised, self-managed way. We've seen a very few examples of local communities owning, managing and using energy produced by decentralised sources. And government, irrespective of their colours, seem to be putting all their money on these huge corporations. The fact is, at the end of the day, they will still own the energy sources, which are so sorely needed in the 21st century. Think about it. Are you in a position to talk to your neighbours and finance, or be in a position to ask for resources to create a decentralised, self-managed energy production in your particular corner of the world? Do we really have to rely on corporate-owned, centralised energy systems which we have no control over, who will then set the price they want to set? So there are different ways of approaching the climate emergency. Different ways. Some ways are much more effective than others. And having a decentralised system in a world which is at the brink of conflict is one way of ensuring energy security. Let's move on. Gaza, the carnage continues. 44,425 people in Gaza, an area half the size of Melbourne, have now died in that conflict, directly killed. Indirectly, for every person directly killed, there's another 5 that are injured. And indirectly, because of the lack of services, because they've been bombed back to the Stone Age and, almost starved to death, there's tens of thousands of others that die. Collateral damage, they call it. Now, the Israeli state, irrespective of how it's painted, has been forced into a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, because its foray into southern Lebanon has had a price as far as the Israeli military is concerned. They're quite concerned of being bogged down in southern Lebanon and offering no respite to the people in Israel, northern Israel. So we've got this so-called 60-day, ceasefire. The dilemma is that this ceasefire is not about decreasing the carnage in Gaza. It's about allowing the Israeli military forces, which are led by a war criminal, which there are arrest warrants after, allowing them to concentrate on Gaza. As I've been saying over and over again for the last, 15 months, I've been saying over and over again, the fact is that the hatred that has been created, the intergenerational hatred that's been created in Gaza by the overreaction of the Israeli Defence Forces, is something which will never go away. The call for vengeance has never been louder. And if there's one thing military campaigns have taught us in the 21st century, is that you cannot destroy an idea. You can bomb people to the dark ages, you can destroy their schools, their hospitals, their roads, you can treat them as less than human, you can kill them. But the fact is, the Israeli government's position is totally untenable, not just in the Middle East, but in the rest of the world, where the rest of the world is beginning to wake up. These atrocities, to a significant degree, are courtesy of the American state. Now, we hear about Putin, the war criminal, in Ukraine over and over again. But when Netanyahu and his former defence minister, arrest warrants are issued by the International Court of Justice in The Hague for their arrest for alleged war crimes, what do we hear from the West? Nothing. Nothing. We continue to hear about the 7th of October, which is understandable. But what do we hear about the hostages today? Nothing. What do we hear about the 44,420 Palestinians who've died directly as a result of Israeli bombardments? This is not hand-to-hand combat. This is a state with an extraordinary arsenal protected by an Iron Dome, using tanks and missiles, bulldozers, to create carnage in one of the most densely populated area, I think the most densely populated area on the planet. A little place called Gaza. And now there's a ceasefire has been announced with Hezbollah for the next 60 days. I can imagine the Israeli Defence Forces will once again continue their atrocities in Gaza. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, brought to you by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. America First Doctrine. So you see, I love the great confabulator because, you see, he loves other authoritarian figures. He sees himself as a big man, right? As the American First Doctrine. Now, I feel really, I'm saddened. Not the fact that the great confabulator was elected by the American people, that's their problem. But I feel saddened that we continue to hold on to the coattails of the USA. Because they don't give a shit about you. You think they may. When it suited them, they cut and ran out of Vietnam. When it suited them, they cut and ran out of Iraq. When it suited them, they cut and ran, out of Afghanistan. The list goes on and on. Now the great confabulator will be sworn in as Presidente on the 20th of January. We hear about, introducing legislation or signing executive orders to punish his neighbours, Canada and Mexico. How extraordinary. And we think these people are going to protect us? You really think a nation that has an American first doctrine is going to protect little old Australia if we need protection? Our protection comes, as I said before in the program, by increasing our alliances in our own region. It doesn't come relying on the USA. Now, Israel relies on the USA, but does that provide them any protection? It may give them some temporary breathing space, but does that provide them protection in the future? Obviously it doesn't, because of the carnage that's occurring and the call for vengeance, which has become almost overpowering. And what do you expect people who live in that situation, as in Gaza, and to a lesser degree in southern Lebanon, think about during this period? Let's move on. The Liberal National Party, they're gearing up to become government. Good old Mr. Dutton. Now, I do know a former policeman who's now dead, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and that was Bill Hayden. Gazumped at the starting gate by Mr. Hawke. Good old Bill Hayden, made Governor-General and died recently in Queensland. So, the fact he's a copper, was an ex-copper, is irrelevant. What's relevant is the Liberal National Party has begun their divisive campaign. It's about dividing us as a people, whether it's where we live, the inner city versus the outer city and the regional areas, whether it's our sexuality, our gender, our belief, our religion. Anywhere they can put in a wedge, we see it. Look at the ludicrous nuclear first campaign they're pushing in a land which is an abundance of sun and wind and water. Really? We're expected to see this as some type of, legitimate response to the climate emergency? Look at the free ride they're getting in the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC and all the virtual platforms which are baying for a Liberal National Party victory. So the little confabulator can work his magic on the great confabulator to protect the people of Australia, from the dark. How extraordinary. How extraordinary. How extraordinary. Now, one of the highlights of the Eureka celebrations is the presentation of the Eureka Australia Day medals at Bakery Hill. And as I said before, there are people you've never heard of and people you may have heard of. And the fact is that these are people who would never, one, be offered to accept a so-called honour from the Australian government. These are people whose activities make a difference. They make a difference to the lives of the people they live with and work with. These are people that we need to acknowledge. These are people who are criminalised, marginalised by this country's media, both virtual and legacy. So this is a situation we find ourselves in constantly. So I'm very pleased to say that at least 6 of the 7 people that have been nominated, seven people have accepted, that were nominated have accepted the medal, and we're hoping to have 6 of them claim the medal, the Eureka Australia Day medal, presented by the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion Celebrations Committee on the 3rd of December at 10 a.m. at Bakery Hill. It's the roundabout, that's right, at the intersection of Victoria and Humphrey Street. And just to show how pathetic things are, if it wasn't for the much maligned Builders Labourers Federation, which was deregistered, years ago, if it wasn't for them, there'd be no Bakery Hill, because McDonald's wanted the whole area to set up their little burger factory. So there is a roundabout, there is a flagpole, there is a Eureka flag, and that's where the presentation will be. So we encourage you, obviously not everybody can get to the 4 a.m. ceremony, but most of you, even living in Melbourne, should be able to get to Ballarat by 10 a.m. Now, the Eureka medalists for this year, and I'll announce them now, are Belinda Coates, and she served as a Greens councillor for the city of Ballarat for 12 years and kept the flag of the West Papuan independence movement and reclaimed the radical spirit of the Eureka Rebellion alive. Unfortunately, Belinda has lost her seat at the last local election. So for 12 years activities on a hostile Ballarat City Council, which is dominated by business interests and conservative interests, I think she's been awarded a medal. Then there's Dr. Lena Cormie. Now, Dr. Lena Cormie was instrumental in getting the state industrial manslaughter laws through the state parliament in Victoria in July 2020. In 2018, her husband, Charlie, was killed at work when a trench collapsed at Delacombe in March 2018. And along with Dave and Janine, whose son Jack was also killed in the collapse, they fought hard for a state industrial manslaughter laws. Then there's John Glazebrook, an activist who's been around for decades, shunned, marginalised, but continues to battle for justice. Barry Horsburgh, a Vietnam veteran, a conscript who was dishonourably discharged for questioning what the Vietnam War was all about. Nasa Mazini, Mashni, the presenter of Palestine Remembered here at Community Radio 3CR and a spokesperson for the Palestinian community during these horrific events over the last 14 months. Annie McLaughlin, a great reporter, broadcaster, connected with Community Radio 3CR, and Senator Lydia Thorpe, who needs no introduction for her resistance to the colonisation process. So thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Hopefully I'll see you at the Eureka celebrations. Now, these aren't council endorsed. These are our celebrations. We reclaim that radical spirit. If you can't make it, don't forget there's a live broadcast from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. on Community Radio 3CR, 3cr.org.au. Don't forget, tonight, Wednesday, is the dinner at Frankston, 6:30 p.m. That's the 27th of November, the last dinner for 2024. Should be an interesting discussion tonight. I've got a few initiatives I want to discuss. You can leave a message on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. If you're thinking you're coming to the Eureka dinner, please book on that number. You can write to me on Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, josephtoscano.com. You can join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. That's PIBCI online. PIBCI.net, PIBCI.net. Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. The list goes on and on. There's a lot of virtual stuff out there, but it's virtual. Remember, come along to the events that we organise. Not only is it about bonding, a bonding together experience, more importantly, it's about changing the future. Listen in to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now, the Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around?
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.